Cheers, guys. Epix 911. Welcome to the Saturday, February 18th, 2017 edition of VR News. Let's start with haptic feedback, specifically suits. If we think of this last year of VR since launch like an oval racetrack, we would be rounding the final corner for the straightaway to the finish line. That's kind of where we're at. And over the course of that, we've seen all kinds of haptic stuff. Gloves, full body suits, ankle stuff, shoes, wrist. You get the picture. A lot. And the reason I bring that up, these guys, NullSpace VR is the company name, and their suit is called Hardlight. It has 16 haptic pads, so it'll be able to do directional impacts. Arrow to your back, you'll feel it. Arrow to your kidney, you'll feel it. That type of stuff. Sounds great. But if, again, someone were to ask me and say, Epix, what would you buy one of these for the first gen? I would say no. For me personally, other than the wireless, I'm done with first gen purchases. So I would get the wireless, okay, the Vive controller, whenever it finally gets to me. Yeah, that too for mixed reality. But essentially wireless, that's it. I'm going to leave haptic for second generation and beyond. And the reason is a lot of these guys are going to go out of business. And the ones that don't will probably have their intellectual property purchased in bankruptcy courts or wherever else. So if they're good, it's going to live on. I'm not worried about that. Again, what I am worried about is how much would support it. Now, a suit like this requires API programming specifically to have games support it. So if you were kind of set on something, I would suggest more something along the lines of the ones that react to music or sound effects, because even though it's not as good, it's going to work with everything. So, plus the whole Kickstarter thing. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. So these guys are trying to do a Kickstarter, and statistically, the more advanced, the more likely it is to fail. Not fail to fund, but fail to deliver post-funding, which is not a hard, fast rule. Obviously, there's ones that buck that trend, but there's a lot that don't. And that would be my concern in my, kind of answer to you asking that question. Next news piece, the crane simulator we talked about a few days ago. Very, very cool update on it. Guest writer to Road to VR, Archaeology, he was the one that first talked about it. Well, what he wanted to do is see if he could use condensed training to actually operate a real crane. Now, just some background. So the company is ITI. They worked with an Edmonton, Canadian company called Serious Labs, who developed the software over the course of 8 months. As a training simulator, it's designed with 18 hours of course training content. And that's for people who want to be full-time or part-time crane operators. So docks, rail yards, warehouses, etc. And he did an hour of that. So you can imagine, basically 5% of the overall training. Now, no big spoiler, would you hire him at the end of the day? Probably not until he finishes. But he was able to turn it on, do basic maneuvers, turn it off without damaging anything or hurting anybody, including himself. So that was good. And just goes to show, again, as an alternative to hands-on, VR is probably second best, and at some point in the future will probably virtually tie for hands-on training compared to other traditional methods like, written training or video-based training. This is hands-on that essentially mimics real life, and it's only going to get better. Very cool. Now, this next story kind of combines a bunch of archaeological things into one header, is what I've done here. First part is a guy from the UK, Stuart Eve, fascinated with history, much like myself, and I know quite a few of you as well. He created an app called Dead Man's Eyes, and it's designed to add reality in VR to historical subjects. So his first one was a tin mining village. This one was located southeastern England, again prehistoric, so kind of the either proto-Celt or before that. And yeah, he brought it to life in this app. So you get a sense of what it really would have been like. And why that's important is we tend to romanticize things, historical things, right? Perfect example would be the galleons and those awesome battles, from Master and Commander, for example, with Russell Crowe. The books are a little bit better in describing the horror of what it was really like, but yeah, it looks like a romantic thing. You mean 8 months on the sea going to Jakarta, Indonesia? Yeah, sign me up. But the reality is, unless you were in the top upper, class of the crew, you weren't doing too well. There were rats. The water probably would eventually kill you. So you would be better served just drinking alcohol, which we know dehydrates you and has its own situations attached to it. All the food was pretty much rotten. Bread had worms in it. You get the gist. It was not a great environment, right? People would urinate. If you've ever been to, an alley outside of any kind of a downtown club, it's a pretty strong smell and it's kind of gross, right? Imagine being on deck or under deck, smelling that constantly. That's what it was. It was basically an open sewer. So very gross, but very important to give you an accurate picture of history. So very, very freaking cool. The other one, and he's working on Battle of Waterloo next, which, is right up there for the Battle of Bosworth Field for me, but I digress. We'll talk about the Roman side now. So the other archaeological piece was Nero's palace. He, of course, being one of the Roman emperors, his palace, the Domus Aurea, which means the Golden House. It was found a few hundred years ago. There was a hole, and artists used it for inspiration. And of course, the Greeks and Romans were the inspiration for the Renaissance, or partial inspiration, but a good chunk of it. Now, what visitors to the palace are going to be able to see via a VR unit is not just what it looks like now, but what it would have looked like in Nero's time. For example, we talk about the reality of the ships, right? Being a lot grimmer than it's portrayed to be. Well, the same is with a lot of the statues that we see. Right now, for most of those, the Vestal Virgins in Greece, for example, you just see white marble. But back then, most of these were colored. So they would have looked like super ultra cartoon-like bright colors and just way more realistic. Most people don't realize that. So they think the ancients, kind of lived with drab white marble around them. Not the case. So again, if it can educate people on history in that way, freaking awesome. Next story, 3D printing and some other VR techs are bringing dinosaurs to VR in much the same way as the previous stuff. We've talked about the crane simulators and we talked to archaeology, and all of that kind of ties together. Not intentionally, that's just kind of how the news worked on this day, but bringing dinosaurs to VR is a great way. Currently, if you're a kid fascinated by dinosaurs, the best place to go is a museum. We have one just in the province over, which is a dinosaur park/museum where a lot of bones have been found in Alberta. Seeing a Brontosaurus skeleton put together is pretty damn awe-inspiring. I've been to a few and it's unforgettable. Well, with VR, you're able to do that too. And I forget what the Rift one is with the T-Rex coming down the hall at you. Being able to not only accurately give you an idea of what the dinosaurs looked like, but the scale, that is just huge. You can't even do, you can via bones, and if you put together some elaborate model, but in VR, you could probably do that quicker and in some ways more realistic too. Next news story, this one comes to us via Richard Northcott. I had seen this and was going to do some more research on it, but it passed me by. So thank you, Richard, for reminding me about this. UK hospital using virtual reality to reassure kids who are about to get MRIs. You might think on the surface that's not a big deal, but if you've ever been in a hospital, and I've had, unfortunate in the sense that I hate seeing kids afflicted with diseases, but when I had some cancerous skin moles removed, I went in for a couple of treatments that were Mickey Mouse compared to what some of these kids, with leukemia and stuff go through. It is just absolutely heartbreaking, right? And how optimistic they can be in the light of that. I guess childhood naivety has a lot to do with that, but trust me, these kids grow up quick going through this, right? So yeah, hospitals can be pretty intimidating places, and MRI machines specifically, they're pretty damn scary if you're a kid. They're loud, you're claustrophobic, kind of locked in, you can't move. So really good idea. Jonathan Ashmore, he is an MRI physicist. He worked closely with a fella, Jerome Di Pietro, who created or helped him create the app. And it's a 360-degree video/app that gives the kids a virtual tour, not just of that wing that they're in, but the whole MRI procedure. So when they go in, they know exactly what to expect. Again, awesome. Very freaking cool. VR's not going anywhere. And stuff like this is just proof positive. The gaming side may be slow, but VR as a technology, it's not going anywhere. Last story. The epic battle brewing between Microsoft and Sony. Well, according to Upload VR and some other sources anyways, that at this year's E3, VR is going to be basically a central battle topic. We know the Sony side of the story, and we know bits and pieces about Microsoft. For example, we know with Microsoft that they're working with multiple hardware partners, that it's going to be Windows 10 friendly. But if we want to get the full picture, let's piece back a little bit further back some of the moves Microsoft has been making. The first, Project Scorpio. You could argue statistically anyways that it's quite a bit more powerful than the PS4 Pro. And I always talk about, for me, it's VR, and that is what it is about. Could care less about all the different branding and et cetera, et cetera. But that's kind of still the point here too. They've got multiple partners, Acer, Lenovo, for example, that they're working with. It's going to be Windows 10 friendly. Project Scorpio is going to be a very powerful machine. Okay, where am I going with this though? Well, the next piece in the puzzle, go back to February, they talked about streaming Xbox games to your PC, right? Windows 10, have the app installed and you can stream. Well, the other thing they did late last year was announce that you will have games playable simultaneously. You buy an Xbox 360 or one game, you can play that on your PC as well. They've been making moves all along that I do imagine, at this E3, they're going to put together a pretty damn good presentation. Almost every year, they've been overshadowed by Sony. And, I got to admit, without Adam and some other elements, last year's Sony one was a little underwhelming compared to previous ones. But Microsoft has always kind of just been meh, right, with their presentations. I think that's going to change this year. I've got a hunch that, they're bracing for battle. And all of these moves, historically over the last year and a bit, all point to that. So that's going to be interesting. Interesting to see. And believe me, guys, June, it's going to roll around fast. All right, guys, that is it for this news night. Hope you guys are having a kick-ass weekend. Cheers.